For more than 4,000 years, ancient Egypt has been wrapped in gold, stone, silence, and mystery. The pyramids stood in the desert like messages from a world that disappeared. The tombs remained sealed. The statues kept staring forward. The names of kings survived on temple walls. But one question remained almost impossible to answer. Who were the ancient Egyptians really? Not just what did they build, not just what gods did they worship, not just how powerful were their kings, but who were they in their blood, in their ancestry, in the hidden code carried inside their bones? For decades, historians studied their art. Archaeologists studied their tombs. Linguists studied their writing. But DNA was the one door that refused to open. Egypt's heat destroyed genetic material. Mummification damaged ancient tissue. Time broke down the evidence, and every time scientists tried to look deeper, the desert seemed to protect its secret. Then, in 2225, something changed. Scientists finally sequenced the whole genome of an ancient Egyptian man from the Old Kingdom era, the age when Egypt was rising toward the Pyramid Age, and what they found did not tell a simple story. It did not give the world one clean answer. It opened a new mystery. Because this man's DNA carried a powerful message from the past. Most of his ancestry connected him to ancient North Africa, but part of his genetic story pointed east, toward the Fertile Crescent, toward Mesopotamia, toward one of the other great cradles of civilization. And suddenly, the story of ancient Egypt looked bigger than many people imagined. Not isolated, not simple, not frozen in one place, but connected, moving, changing, and tied to a world of trade, migration, technology, and human contact that began thousands of years before modern borders existed. But the strangest part is this. The man whose DNA changed the conversation was not a pharaoh. He was not a famous king. He was not buried under a golden mask. He may have been a worker, possibly a potter, a man whose bones carried the marks of labor, a man who lived, worked, aged, suffered, and died more than 4,000 years ago. And somehow, his body preserved the genetic clue that historians had been waiting for. So the real question is not only what his DNA revealed. The real question is why this one man survived time when so many others did not, and why his bones may now force us to rethink one of the greatest civilizations in human history. Ancient Egypt has always been one of the world's biggest historical obsessions. Every generation returns to the same images: the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, the Nile, the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the temples of Luxor, the painted tombs, the mysterious mummies. But behind all of that beauty is a deeper problem. Most people know ancient Egypt through kings and monuments. They see the civilization from the top down: pharaohs, priests, queens, dynasties, wars, temples, burials. But civilizations are not only built by kings, they are built by ordinary people: farmers, craftsmen, boatmen, potters, stoneworkers, scribes, families, people whose names never reached history books. And for a long time, those ordinary Egyptians stayed silent. Their faces were carved on walls, their tools were found in settlements, their bones were sometimes recovered. But their genetic story remained mostly hidden. That is why the 2025 genome study became so important. It was not just another ancient DNA result, it was a rare look inside a person from early dynastic Egypt, a time close to the birth of the Pyramid Age, a period when Egypt was becoming one of the most powerful organized states on earth. This was the time when kings were consolidating power, when writing was becoming part of administration, when monuments were becoming larger, when specialized labor, trade networks, and state control were transforming society. And now, for the first time, scientists could read the genetic code of a man who lived inside that world. Not through legend, not through paintings, not through royal propaganda, but through DNA. The remains came from Nuweirat, a site in Middle Egypt near Beni Hassan. They were excavated in 1902. For more than a century, the skeleton remained in museum collections. It survived time, storage, and even the violent chaos of the modern world. But the biggest surprise was not that the bones survived. The surprise was that the DNA survived. Ancient DNA from Egypt is extremely difficult to recover. Heat is the enemy of genetic material. And Egypt's climate is not gentle. Over thousands of years, DNA breaks into smaller and smaller fragments. Moisture, bacteria, and temperature changes can destroy what is left. This is why ancient DNA has often been easier to recover from cold places than from hot deserts. So when scientists looked at this Egyptian skeleton, success was not guaranteed. It was a long shot. But the burial itself may have protected the body in a special way. The man was placed inside a large ceramic vessel. That vessel was inside a rock-cut tomb. The conditions may have created a small protected environment, shielding the remains from some of the damage that usually destroys DNA in Egypt. And because the man lived before artificial mummification became standard in Egypt, his remains may have avoided some of the chemical and physical processes that damaged genetic material. In other words, his unusual burial may have become a time capsule, a ceramic container holding not gold, not treasure, not royal jewelry, but something far more powerful, a genome. When researchers extracted DNA from his teeth, they were not just studying bones, they were opening a sealed message from the Old Kingdom. Teeth can preserve DNA better than many other parts of the body because the root area can protect genetic material deep inside hard tissue. And from that hidden material, scientists were finally able to sequence the man's whole genome. This is where the story becomes explosive. Because the genome did not show one simple origin, it showed connection. The study found that most of the man's ancestry was related to ancient North African populations. That makes sense. He lived in Egypt. He was part of a civilization deeply tied to the Nile Valley and surrounding North African world. But the second part was the detail that caught attention. A significant part of his ancestry was related to ancient populations from the Eastern Fertile Crescent, including Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. That does not mean ancient Egyptians were simply Mesopotamian. It does not mean one civilization created the other, and it does not mean the entire Egyptian population looked exactly like this one individual. This was one man, one genome, one sample. Scientists themselves are careful about that, but even one genome can be powerful when it comes from a time and place where almost no genetic evidence existed before. And this one genome fits into something archaeologists had already suspected. Ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia were not sealed off from each other. They were connected by trade, ideas, materials, and technology. Long before modern passports, borders, and national identities, ancient people moved. Goods moved, crafts moved, stories moved, skills moved. And sometimes, people themselves moved across huge distances. The Fertile Crescent was one of the most important regions in early civilization. Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was home to early cities, writing systems, agriculture, craft specialization, and complex states. Egypt, along the Nile, was building its own powerful civilization at the same time. For years, historians noticed signs that these worlds may have influenced each other, shared artistic motifs, trade goods, technology, imported materials, connections across the Levant and Near East. But now, DNA added another layer, not just cultural contact, possible human connection. The genetic signal suggested that the man from Nuweirat was part of a population history shaped by both local North African ancestry and Eastern connections, and that is why history was not ready, because ancient Egypt is often presented as a mystery locked inside itself, a civilization that rose almost like a miracle from the desert. But DNA suggests a more human story. Civilizations are not miracles, they are networks. They rise from rivers, resources, ideas, labor, exchange, and contact. Because the ancient world was not silent, it was communicating. But then comes the question that makes this story even deeper. Who was this man? If his DNA carried such an important clue, was he someone powerful? Was he an elite official, a noble, a priest, a royal servant? The answer is strange. His burial was not ordinary. A rock-cut tomb suggests status. Not everyone received that kind of treatment. But his bones tell another story. His skeleton showed signs of a hard physical life. He was likely older when he died, perhaps around his 60s, which was a long life for that time. His body showed age-related problems and physical stress. Researchers noticed marks that suggested repeated movements, possibly from sitting for long periods with limbs extended. One interpretation is that he may have been a potter or a craftsman doing similar work, and that creates a powerful contradiction. A man with signs of labor was buried in a way that suggests unusual importance. This is where one skeleton becomes a story. Because ancient DNA does not only tell us where ancestry came from, it also forces us to look at the life behind the bones. This man was not a statistic, he was a person. He may have spent years working with clay, shaping vessels, repeating motions that left their signature on his body. He may have watched Egypt change around him. He may have lived as early pyramid projects were beginning to transform the landscape. He may have seen royal power expanding, workshops growing, trade moving, and new technologies entering Egyptian life. And then, after death, he was placed inside a ceramic vessel. If he was truly a potter, the symbolism is almost haunting. A man who may have shaped clay in life was preserved by clay in death. And thousands of years later, that clay may have helped protect the DNA that made him famous. The object that surrounded him became the reason we can still hear him. That is the kind of detail history rarely gives us. But when it does, it changes everything. Now imagine the moment in the laboratory. Scientists are not looking at a golden crown. They are not opening a treasure chest. They are studying tiny fragments of ancient genetic material. A tooth, a root, a sequence, a pattern. Letters of life broken by time, then reconstructed by modern technology. And as the data becomes clearer, a hidden map begins to appear. North Africa, Egypt, Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia-related ancestry. A single man becomes a bridge between regions, and the story of early Egypt becomes harder to reduce to a simple origin. This is why ancient DNA can be so disruptive, but those patterns must be interpreted carefully. One genome cannot represent all ancient Egyptians. Egypt lasted for thousands of years. Its population changed across dynasties, regions, invasions, migrations, trade periods, and political shifts. The people of the Old Kingdom were not identical to the people of the New Kingdom. People in the Delta may have had different connections than people in Upper Egypt. People near trade routes may have had different ancestry patterns than isolated communities. So this discovery is not the final answer. It is the first real door. And that makes it more exciting. Because if one man revealed this much, what could 10 more genomes reveal? That is the future this discovery points toward. For a long time, ancient Egypt was studied through stones and symbols. Now it may be studied through genomes. But there's another reason this story matters. Ancient Egypt is not just history, it is identity. But ancient DNA is showing something more complicated. Ancient people did not live according to modern identity categories. They were shaped by geography, migration, environment, intermarriage, trade, language, and power. The man from Nuweirat was ancient Egyptian. His life was Egyptian. His burial was Egyptian. His world was the Nile Valley. But his genome also carried signals of wider ancient connections. That does not erase Egypt. It reveals Egypt. Because real civilizations are never as simple as myths make them. The deeper we look, the more connected the ancient world becomes. This is the part that can change how we imagine the Pyramid Age. When we picture ancient Egypt, we often imagine a world of stone monuments and royal commands. But beneath that was movement. This does not make Egypt less original. It makes Egypt part of the human story. Every great civilization is both local and connected. It grows from its own soil, but it also absorbs the world around it. Egypt's genius was not isolation. Egypt's genius was transformation. It could take materials, ideas, and influences, then turn them into something unmistakably Egyptian. That is why the DNA result is so powerful. It does not destroy the mystery of Egypt. It deepens it. Because now the mystery is not just how Egypt built pyramids. It is how Egypt became Egypt. What hidden movements shaped its early population? How far did its connections reach before the pyramids? How much did ordinary workers contribute to the rise of the state? And how many unknown lives are still waiting inside museum collections? The man from Nuweirat spent more than a century after excavation in a museum. For decades, he was not famous. He was not a household name. He was not displayed like a pharaoh. But science changed his role. Modern technology turned him from an anonymous skeleton into one of the most important genetic witnesses in Egyptian history. That is almost poetic. The kings built pyramids to be remembered. But one ordinary man's tooth may have told us something the kings never could. Together, they show a civilization made not only of rulers, but of humans. This is why this discovery should not be treated like a simple headline. It is not just Egyptians had this ancestry or Egyptians came from there. That is too small. The real story is that ancient Egypt was part of a dynamic world, a world where North Africa and West Asia were already linked, a world where technology and people moved together, a world where a man buried in clay could carry the biological evidence of ancient contact. And that evidence survived because of one unusual burial. Now think about the timing. This man lived around the age when Egypt was moving into one of its most iconic periods, the Old Kingdom, the age of monumental building, the era that would produce pyramids so massive that people still debate how they were built. But DNA reminds us that pyramids were not built by mystery alone. They were built by bodies, by workers, by craft specialists, by administrators, by people who ate, aged, suffered, and died. The story of Egypt is not only in the stones, it is in the skeletons, it is in the teeth, it is in the traces of movement left on bones, it is in the genetic fragments that survived against all odds. And maybe that is why this discovery feels so different. It brings ancient Egypt down from the level of myth and back into the level of human life. But there is still one warning. This is only the beginning. Anyone who says this one genome solves all questions about ancient Egyptian identity is going too far. Science is powerful, but science needs patterns, more samples, more time periods, more regions, more comparisons. The Nuweirat man is not the entire civilization. He is the first page of a book that was almost impossible to open. And that first page says something fascinating. Ancient Egypt was deeply rooted in North Africa, but not disconnected from the wider ancient world. Its people were part of a landscape of movement. Its rise happened in a world of exchange. Its early story may include connections that older archaeology could only hint at. Now, DNA is beginning to confirm that the ancient world was more connected than many people imagined. This changes the way we think about history, because history is often taught as separated boxes. Egypt here, Mesopotamia there, the Levant somewhere between them, North Africa on one side, West Asia on the other, but the people who lived then did not see the world through our textbook chapters. They followed rivers, they crossed deserts, they traded stones, metals, pottery, grain, animals, and ideas. They married, they migrated, they carried traditions, they carried genes, and thousands of years later those movements were still written inside one man's DNA. That is the hidden truth. The ancient world was not still, it was alive, and the people inside it were more connected than stone ruins can show. So when the title says history wasn't ready, this is what it means. History was ready for temples, ready for kings, ready for pyramids, ready for hieroglyphs, ready for golden masks. But it was not ready for an ordinary man's genome to speak louder than royal propaganda. It was not ready for a potter-like skeleton to become a bridge between North Africa and the Fertile Crescent. It was not ready for clay, teeth, and DNA to challenge the idea that ancient civilizations rose in isolation. And it was not ready for science to show that the past is not dead. It is waiting. Waiting in museums, waiting in tombs, waiting inside bone, waiting inside teeth, waiting for tools powerful enough to read it. This is why the Nuweirat genome matters. It is not just a discovery about one man. It is a signal that ancient Egyptian DNA can survive, a signal that more evidence may be possible, a signal that one of the most studied civilizations on Earth still has secrets buried inside human remains. And if scientists can recover more genomes from ancient Egypt, the next discoveries could be even bigger. They could reveal how populations changed before and after pyramid construction. They could show whether Delta Egyptians had stronger Eastern connections than Upper Egyptians. They could compare workers and elites. They could track the impact of trade, invasion, migration, and empire. They could finally move the debate from speculation to evidence. But even now, with just one whole genome, something important has already changed. Ancient Egypt is no longer only a civilization of stone. It is becoming a civilization of DNA. And that means the next chapter of Egyptian history may not come from a newly opened tomb full of gold. It may come from a tooth in a museum drawer, a skeleton forgotten for a century, a burial no one expected to matter, a trace of life almost destroyed by heat. That is the power of modern science. It can make the silent speak. It can turn the forgotten into evidence. It can show that the past is not only written by kings. Sometimes the deepest truth is carried by ordinary people. And maybe that is the most shocking part of all. The man who helped reveal early Egyptian ancestry was not remembered by name. No temple was built for him. No famous inscription celebrated him. No golden mask protected his face. But his body protected something greater than fame. It protected the code of a civilization. And after more than 4,000 years, that code finally spoke. It said ancient Egypt was local but connected. African but linked to the wider ancient Near East. Unique but not isolated. Powerful but human. And still full of unanswered questions. So, the next time you look at the pyramids, remember this. Their stones are not the only mystery. The real mystery is the people, the hands that shaped clay, the bodies that carried stone, the families that lived along the Nile, the travelers who crossed ancient routes, the genes that moved quietly through generations, and the unknown man from Nuweirat, whose DNA survived long enough to remind the modern world that history is never finished. Because sometimes the biggest secrets of a civilization are not hidden in gold. They're hidden in bone. They're hidden in teeth. They're hidden in DNA.